Hello and welcome to Metabolic Entanglement. This is episode 3 of the series on Metabolic Syndrome and the second episode of the mini-series on energy metabolism. In the first two episodes we gave a general explanation of what Metabolic Syndrome is and why evolution created us as we are. And if you missed them and want to know more, you can find them on the YouTube channel of Metabolic Entanglement. If you remember, in the previous episode we talked about how our cells have to turn their food into energy on their own and also that they need energy all the time. Those two requirements that Mother Nature set in front of us forced us to evolve, to be able to make energy from many nutrients and to be able to extract a large amount of energy from them. So in this episode, we're going to talk about the nutrients we make ATP from, and we will try to find the answers to a few questions. What are nutrients and how we classify them? How many types of nutrients our cells use to make energy? And how we convert those nutrients into energy. So, if you're ready, 3, 2, 1, let's roll! Nutrients. We people eat things like pizza, sandwiches and lasagna, but the menu of our cells is made of nutrients. We all know that the standard way to classify all nutrients is to divide them into 6 groups: water, vitamins, minerals, fat, proteins and carbohydrates. Unfortunately, this classification is too general for our purpose and doesn't give us enough information, because not all nutrients are used by our cells for energy, and also the menu of the cells includes not only the nutrients that come from our food, but also the nutrients that we can produce in our body. So, to understand how our energy metabolism works, we need to refurbish the old classification and to build a new, complete and correct menu of our cells. Let's start with the nutrients we absorb from the food and beverages we consume. The first thing is to remove water, vitamins and minerals from the cell's menu, because they are not a source of energy for our cells. That way we have left only the groups of fats, proteins and carbs. But the proteins are not a major source of energy. They are mainly building materials, and usually less than 10% of the energy comes from proteins. In addition, to convert them into energy, we either do it the way we convert carbs, or we convert them straight into carbs or fats. So for now, we will remove them from the list by adding them both to fats and carbs at the same time. That way, we have left just our two main energy sources, fats and carbs. And because these are the two main sources of energy for our body, we usually say that we either burn fats or burn carbs. But unfortunately, things are not so easy and simple, because we have different types of fats and different types of carbs, and we have to look at them in more detail. Let's start with the fats. I'm sure you've heard of many types of fats, such as trans fats, saturated fats, hydrogenated fats, triglycerides, cholesterol, omega-3, omega-6, good and bad, and who knows what else. And that's because there are different criteria by which fats can be classified. But what unites all fats is that they are all made from fatty acids. Fatty acids, on the other hand, are made of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen, with carbon atoms linked in chains of different lengths. Our cells can separate the carbon atoms and use the energy that binds them to recharge our ATP batteries. Okay, now let's see the carbs, which by the way are also called sugars. They are also made of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen, and our cells again use the energy locked between the carbon atoms, but things here are a little bit more complicated, because we have a wide variety of chemical structures. The main carbs we get from the food we eat are two: glucose and fructose. Glucose is the so-called blood sugar, and fructose is the so-called fruit sugar. But beside them, we have more carbs. Although in smaller quantities, we have galactose. This is the sugar found in milk and dairy products. Ethanol, this is the sugar found in alcohol, and many different sugar alcohols, also called polyols. They are produced by specific fermentation of alcohol and other plant products. So, from the food we consume, in the menu of the cells we have fatty acids, glucose, fructose, galactose, ethanol, and sugar alcohols. I don't know about you, but to me this list is long and complicated. So now we will explain it and simplify it. As an amount, sugar alcohols are the least common in the food we eat. In addition, they are not fully absorbed and utilized by the body. And if we convert them into energy, we do it the way we convert fructose. So we will put them in the fructose group. Ethanol, unlike sugar alcohols, is quickly and easily absorbed and utilized. But at the end of the day, we still convert it into energy the way we convert fructose. So he goes in the fructose group also. Galactose has almost the same formula as glucose, and after some processing we use it the same way as we use glucose, and therefore it goes into the glucose group. That way we reduce the cell's menu down to the three main nutrients we absorb from the food we consume: fatty acids, glucose, and fructose. But to make this list complete, we need to add one more nutrient that our body can produce: the ketones. Ketones are nutrients that are produced by our liver cells when they process fatty acids. The more fatty acids the liver processes, the more ketones it produces. There are three types of ketones, but for now we will talk about them simply by calling them ketones. Ketones are not exactly fats. They are water-soluble fatty acids, but because they are products that we get from fats, we will put them into the group of fats. So, the final list of nutrients in the menu of our cells contains two main groups: fats and carbs. The group of fats includes fatty acids and ketones, and the group of carbs includes glucose and fructose. So far so good. Now let's see how we convert those nutrients into energy. As we already said, all nutrients have different structures, built of carbon, C, hydrogen, H, and oxygen, O. And we have a complex system of several sequentially connected groups of processes that allow us to convert those nutrients and the oxygen we breathe into energy, carbon dioxide, CO2, and water, H2O. At the bottom of this system is the electron transport chain, which generally speaking works on the principle of electricity and supplies about 90% of the energy we use. This electron transport chain uses negatively charged molecules called NADH and FADH. Most of those molecules are derived from another cycle of processes that precedes the electron transport chain, and it's called the Krebs cycle. As in this cycle we produce about 5 to 6% of the energy we use. All nutrients can go through the Krebs cycle and through the electron transport chain. And this is possible because all nutrients go through different processes that turn them into one common mini-nutrient, which is called acetyl-coenzyme A, or for short acetyl-CoA. Generally speaking, acetyl-CoA is a group of two carbon atoms that have energy locked between them. Okay, now let's see how we convert our nutrients into acetyl-CoA. There are two different biochemical pathways which we can use to do this: glycolysis and beta oxidation. Glycolysis is the pathway of glucose and beta oxidation is the pathway of fatty acids. Glycolysis is the process that converts glucose into acetyl-CoA. Hence the name of the process. Glycolysis means splitting glucose in two. Glucose is a 6-carbon ring, and when it's divided in two, we get two separated groups of 3 carbon atoms. The halves, now called pyruvate, undergo through the so-called preparation phase, where we remove 1 carbon atom from each group and we receive 2 molecules of acetyl-CoA from 1 molecule of glucose. Let's see the other pathway now. Beta oxidation is a series of processes that convert fatty acids into acetyl-CoA. As we already said, fatty acids are chains of carbon atoms, and those chains have different lengths, from 2 to more than 30 carbon atoms. But the most common one have between 8 and 24 carbons in length. Beta oxidation is a cyclic process that shortens the fatty acids by 2 carbon atoms in each cycle and converts them into acetyl-CoA. So far so good. Now let's look at the whole picture. Let's start with glucose and see how we convert it into ATP, CO2 and H2O. Glucose must first undergo the process of glycolysis. But in order to split glucose in two and to remove 1 carbon atom from each of the halves, we need some energy, so we use 2 ATPs. But later we get 4 ATPs from the whole process, so as a final result we get the first 2 ATP molecules, 2 molecules of CO2, 4 NADH molecules that we will use later in the electron transport chain, and 2 acetyl-CoA molecules that we will use in the Krebs cycle. Now those 2 acetyl-CoAs enter the Krebs cycle and we produce from them 2 more ATPs, 4 molecules of CO2, 6 NADHs and 2 FADHs. So as a total, from glycolysis and the Krebs cycle we get 4 ATPs, 6 CO2s, 10 NADHs and 2 FADHs. As you can see, we already separated all 6 carbon atoms and turned them into CO2. We also made some ATP and we transferred all the remaining energy to the negatively charged NADH and FADH. In the last phase, all NADH and FADH molecules donate their electrons to the electron transport chain, and the chain produces for each NADH molecule 3 ATP molecules, and for each FADH molecule 2 ATP molecules, respectively. Because we have 10 NADH molecules, from them we get 30 ATP, and we also have 2 FADH molecules, and for them we get 4 ATP. So we get a total of 34 ATP from the electron transport chain. In addition, the electron transport chain produces water as a byproduct, because the positively charged hydrogen atoms that oppose the negatively charged particles combine with oxygen to form H2O. So in general, 1 molecule of glucose gives us 38 ATP, 6 CO2 and some water. Okay, now let's see the fatty acids. Fatty acids must first undergo the process of beta oxidation. As we already said, beta oxidation is a cyclic process in which we separate the carbon atoms 2 at a time. Let's take the standard example with fatty acid that has a chain of 16 carbon atoms. This fatty acid must first go through the beta oxidation cycle 7 times to be broken down into 8 2-carbon molecules. And in addition, each cycle produces 1 NADH and 1 FADH. That way, only from the division of the chain we get 8 acetyl-CoA, 7 NADH and 7 FADH molecules. and there are 7 because the last chain divides the last 4 into 2 pairs. After that, those 8 acetyl-CoAs enter the Krebs cycle, where for each acetyl-CoA we get 1 ATP, 2 CO2s, 3 NADHs and 1 FADH. Which means that from these 8 acetyl-CoAs we will get 8 ATPs, 16 CO2s, 24 NADHs and 8 FADHs. So now for the electron transport chain we already have 31 NADHs and 15 FADHs. And as we already said, for every NADH we get 3 ATP, which equals 93 ATP. And for every FADH we receive 2 ATP, which equals 15 ATP. And we also make some water. So, as a total, from one 16 carbon long fatty acid chain we have 131 ATPs. In fact, we get 130 ATP because in the beginning we have to use 1 ATP to activate the beta oxidation process. By the way, you've just learned how mitochondria work, because electron transport chain, Krebs cycle and beta oxidation are processes that occur only in mitochondria. Just glycolysis happens outside mitochondria. Glycolysis usually yields about 5% of the energy we need, and the remaining 95% are produced by the mitochondria. That's why mitochondria are usually called the powerhouse of the cells. We talk about plural mitochondria because we have hundreds to thousands of mitochondria in each cell. The more energy a cell needs, the more mitochondria there are. Even fat cells that generally need just a little energy have at least 30 to 40 mitochondria. But let's go back to turning food into energy. These are the 2 biochemical pathways we can use to convert nutrients into energy. These pathways are strongly regulated, and they're regulated because our cells need constant energy levels. This regulation is done by many different substances, and generally speaking, if we have enough energy available in the cells, we slow down the conversion of food into energy and we use those nutrients for something else. And if we don't have enough energy, then we stimulate the conversion of food into energy. Okay, but if those are the 2 possible pathways, then where is the place of ketones and fructose in the whole scheme? But to answer this question, we must first know a little bit more about the functions of our liver. The liver is the central organ of our metabolism. The hepatocyte cells that make up the liver are unique in their functionality, and they can process in all sorts of ways almost all the nutrients and chemicals we encounter. They can produce fatty acids, glucose, fructose, proteins, ketones, and many more. In general, if something turns into something else, that usually happens in the cells of our liver. Okay, let's see now what is the story of the ketones, and we will leave fructose for dessert. As we already said, ketones are produced by our liver when it processes larger amounts of fatty acids. But now that we know how beta oxidation works and what is acetyl-CoA, it's much easier to explain what ketones are. When our liver cells begin to beta oxidize more fatty acids, they begin to accumulate more acetyl-CoA. And in this situation, the liver cells start to fuse back some acetyl-CoA, and that's how we get the ketones. Ketones then enter the bloodstream and can be used by the cells in other organs. Ketones consist of short chains of 4 or 3 carbon atoms, and they are much smaller than the standard fatty acids. They can travel more easily in the bloodstream, and that's why we say that they are water soluble. They also can reach our cells easier than other nutrients. We can use for energy the ketones that are made of 4 carbon atoms by separating them back to acetyl-CoA. In the case of ketones, their smaller size plays a big role, because some cells have higher level of protection and are better shielded from the environment. Brain cells are usually given as an example. The blood vessels that deliver food and oxygen to the brain are tightly surrounded by the so-called blood-brain barrier, which protects our brain cells from harmful substances that can circulate in our blood. But this protection also blocks standard long-chain fatty acids, and they cannot pass it because they have a larger size. This is why you can often come across the idea that the brain uses only glucose for energy. But the brain can use glucose, ketones, proteins, and other short-chain fatty acids that can sneak along the barrier. It is just that if we consume glucose all the time, then there is no point for our body to produce a lot of ketones. But we'll talk about that in the next episodes. For now, let's just say that ketones are kind of a glucose substitutes, because in the cases when our body does not process a large amount of glucose, it begins to process a larger amount of fatty acids, and then the liver begins to produce a larger amount of ketones. Okay, now let's see what's up with fructose. I don't know if you noticed, but the whole system is divided into two: water-soluble and water-insoluble, carbs and fats. In this light, fructose, like glucose, is carbohydrate, and it is water-soluble, which allows fructose to travel freely in the blood. The problem occurs when fructose has to pass from the blood inside the cell. The walls of our cells are made primarily of fats, because fats are a good water isolator. And while fatty acids can easily enter and exit the cells, by mixing with the fats that form the cell walls, carbs must use special channels that allow them to enter the cells. Fructose, just like glucose, is made of 6 carbon atoms, but it has a different structure. The difference between glucose and fructose is that glucose forms a circle of 6 segments, and fructose forms a circle of 5 segments. That's why they use different channels to enter the cells. And while all cells in the body have many channels that can let glucose in, not all the cells have the ability to absorb fructose. The main cells that can take fructose are the cells of our liver. It is estimated that between 80 and 90% of the fructose is absorbed by the liver cells, and the more fructose we consume, the higher the percentage goes. Inside the liver cells, fructose can take 2 possible pathways. It can be converted into energy, or it can be converted into any of the other nutrients. In order to be converted into energy, fructose undergoes its own biochemical pathway called fructolysis. But even though it has its own name, fructolysis is not exactly a separated biochemical pathway, because it is pretty much the same as glycolysis. It divides fructose in two. The difference between glycolysis and fructolysis is that glycolysis is highly regulated, and if we have enough energy, then glucose is not converted into acetyl-CoA. And fructolysis is poorly regulated, and almost nothing stops the process of converting fructose into acetyl-CoA. Respectively, liver cells begin to accumulate a large amount of acetyl-CoA, and they have to do something with this excess acetyl-CoA. As we already said, liver cells are the supercells of our metabolism, and they can do everything with all nutrients. They can convert this acetyl-CoA into ketones, but because there is always glucose present in the foods that contain fructose, they won't do that, because our body does not need many ketones when we have enough glucose. Of course, they won't turn it back into fructose either, so we have 2 options left: glucose and fatty acids. But as we already said, foods that contain fructose always contain glucose, and that's why in practice about 90% of the fructose we consume is converted into fatty acids, and then those fatty acids are used for energy when we need them. Well, now is the time to make the final list. The official menu of the cells is reduced to two main food groups, fats and carbs, and we have four main nutrients, fatty acids, ketones, glucose and fructose. But these nutrients are utilized in only two ways, in the form of fatty acids and in the form of glucose. So now we are going to do something that no one else does, and we're going to move fructose out of the carbs group and put it into fats group, because it is used in the form of fatty acids. So the official menu of the cells consists of two groups of nutrients, fats and carbs. In the group of the fats we have the group of all fatty acids, the group of all ketones, and the fructose group. And the group of the carbs consists only of the glucose group. And if we add oxygen, then the menu of our cells will be complete and correctly arranged. What we need to take home from this episode is, first, that we convert the food into energy using two biochemical pathways, the fatty acids pathway and the glucose pathway. The second thing to remember is that fructose is converted into fat and used for energy in the form of fatty acids. And the last thing we need to remember is that ketones are just a substitute for glucose, and that we start producing more ketones when we have less glucose available in the body. And now, as usual, we have to make our disclaimers. I'm not a doctor. The content is for informational purposes only and does not constitute medical or other professional advice. I don't work for a food or medical company, and I do not receive funding from any industry. I don't like to use qualifiers like good, bad, healthy and unhealthy because they can be subjective, misleading and generalizing. I will try to keep my language as understandable as possible, and at the risk of not being extremely correct, I will try to explain biochemistry in layman's terms. That was all for now. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And if you are interested in the topics we discussed in this video, you can find more information on the YouTube channel of Project Metabolic Entanglement. Thanks again and bye bye.